And here we are, Jeff York of the Establishing Shot. I got the introduction right out of the way for
There we
James. This is
go.
this is good, making progress. And I am Ian Simmons of Kicking the Seat, and we are here tonight to talk about Blue Beetle. The latest and one of the last Warner Brothers DCEU films in this incarnation. As many people are aware, James Gunn, formerly of Marvel fame, formerly of Trauma fame, of course, he is one of the new stewards of the DC franchise for Warner Brothers, and has announced that in, I think, 2025 he's come out with his new Superman project, and that's going to kick off a whole bunch of new movies and TV shows and animated things. But we still have a couple of these films that are, kind of like the last train leaving the station of the old regime. The last one, I think, is Aquaman 2, which is allegedly coming out later this year. And we have Blue Beetle, which, conflicting reports. I've heard that this is kind of one of the last gasps of this current era. I've also heard that Jaime Reyes, who's the character of Blue Beetle in this movie, may be like the Nick Fury of this new this new James Gunn iteration,
That's
based
funny.
on the abysmal performance at the box office this weekend, which we'll talk a bit more about that as well. I don't know that that's in the cards. Might be. Who knows? I guess it all depends on if people find this film. I saw it last night for the $6 Tuesday at the AMC, and it was a pretty packed house, a pretty excited crowd. So that was encouraging. But before we get into all of that, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Great to see you. Thank you for, again, having me on your show. I love doing it, and it's always a good discussion. And whether it's 2 or 6, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, we are a couple of Earth's Mightiest Critics, so it may just be us tonight hanging out and talking Blue Beetle. And that's totally cool. There's a lot to talk about. Before we went on, folks, by the way, those who are watching either now or in the future, feel free to drop some comments and questions, and we'll answer them if they're live, or later on we'll try and get to them maybe in a future episode. But we want to hang out and talk about this film. But we were discussing before we went live that you were generally positive on the film. You weren't raving about it, but I think it was probably a surprise that you enjoyed it as much as you did. And I said that I didn't really have a reaction to Blue Beetle. I certainly didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I don't even know if I liked it. I had like this weird out of body experience for the entire 2 hours and 7 minutes, mostly because I was just like in my head doing comparisons of like, well, this is from this movie and this is
Right.
from that movie, and it's pretty much exclusively stolen material with a fresh coat of paint and the DCU branding. But that seems to work for more so for some than others. But tell me about your expectations going into Blue Beetle, Jeff, and what your experience was like watching it. And you saw it a little while ago,
Right.
so you've had some time to marinate on it. What do you think of it? Do you think of it?
Well, I don't think it's in any way, shape, or form top tier superhero film quality. But having said that, knowing that there's been so many problems with the DC universe, I mean, it's funny you mentioned at the top of the show that this one had, probably wasn't going to necessarily build into anything, not only because of James Gunn coming in and kind of maybe potentially putting all these previous choices sort of to the wayside, but also this was the 7th DCEU movie now that has kind of flopped, in a way. That's not to say that some didn't have their merits and critically were perceived well, but compared to what they cost and what expectations were, Harley Quinn, Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, Suicide Squad, Black Adam, the second Shazam, Fury of the Gods, The Flash, now Blue Beetle, were very much under expectations. And so, if you're writing for Deadline or the Hollywood Reporter, you probably say it's a bomb, or it's a dud or a flop or whatever. But for me, what I liked about this and where I would give it a surprisingly sort of good review. As I walked in, as I do with all movies, Ian, trying to give it the benefit of the doubt. Like when the lights go down, as Pauline Kaelman said, I'm always hopeful. I'm always saying this could be good, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, even if it maybe is an actor or director that I necessarily haven't always liked in the past. I kind of forget that when I'm there saying like, okay, impress me. Maybe this is the one. And case in point, recently, I mean, I continue to have to fight a couple of my friends and fellow critics about how good Oppenheimer is, and I've never been a Christopher Nolan fan, so I think I'm pretty open-minded about most of these things, and can change when I think a film hits me a certain way that's maybe better than the oeuvre of the filmmaker. For me, this one hit a lot of the boxes, which I'm now expecting when I go into these kind of movies, because there's only, to your point, so much you can do that isn't utterly derivative. I mean, the origin story and the reluctant hero, and he doesn't know how to handle the suit, and he's not sure if he wants to be it, and the existential crisis of all that kind of stuff, as well as there's usually a girl in some peril, and somebody who's close to him dies, and to sort of push him into the hero mode. And then there's always a corporate villain. It seems that they're so easy to do, but they're always some sort of thing like that, and they always end up sort of, gee whiz, surprise, surprise. Do they vanquish them at the end? Of course they do. I don't know if you have to put the spoilers thing up quite yet, but what I did like about this one is, and I maybe am a sucker for this because I don't know a great deal about Hispanic culture and sort of that directly, but I found the family very entertaining and sort of his connection with them. And I also hand it to the filmmakers because I thought it was pretty clever that they stay involved throughout the entire thing. A lot of times, it's like, okay, well, they've been the comic relief and they've been sort of the establishment of who he is and what he cares for, and we'll just put them over here and now it's time to fight. I mean, Aunt May sort of figures in the action in the Spider-Man movies, but sometimes she's also, out for a couple of reels. Here, these people were kind of involved all the way from soup to nuts, and even to the point where they're figuring in the big fight at the end, which is a little ridiculous. I mean, Grandma turns out to be Rambo, which is, so low-hanging fruit and silly, but
it's Grambo. Here you go.
Ooh, I love it. Nice. Grambo. Yes, Grambo. But hot damn if it isn't pretty cheeky and funny. I mean, I found it kind of likable and silliness and stuff. And then this one, I thought, I sort of said in my review that it was sort of the little film that could, or the little superhero that could. I don't think there were a lot of expectations for it. They don't nearly the budget that these things usually have. No big stars. I mean, the closest you get is George Lopez as the comic relief uncle, and then of course Susan Sarandon, who hasn't really starred in many movies lately, but she's the villain, and surprising how little she's actually in it. It's a bunch of newcomers who I didn't know, and they had their charms, and the whole thing to me kind of gave me this form of, I don't sound like an easy sentimental old fluff, but a little bit of the warm fuzzies while I was watching this go on, because I kind of dug the family, and they're talking about their situation, and this small home that they are trying to make the payments on, and then it gets destroyed, and it's like, this kind of hurts and stuff. So it's modest charms. I think it's a very modest film. Especially when you compare it to so many of these other things like The Flash, which we talked about. Oh my God, how much CGI is thrown around in that. But I liked a lot of The Flash nonetheless. But this one I thought was very modest. And because of that, I guess I was charmed. But I would not say it's, one of those that I will say in a couple of years I'll remember as the 10 greatest superhero movies. But for right now in the summer, where there was some ups and downs with some of the superhero stuff, and certainly on television and with some of the stuff that's going on with the Disney Marvel shows and stuff like that, I found this one to be sort of earnestly adorable. So maybe that's modest, but that's kind of my sort of takeaway from it.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I'd heard, of course, there's the pre-release buzz, which is this is going to flop, and the word of mouth is not good. But then I know people who actually saw it at early screenings and were kind of talking about it, and you were one of them. And so I was like, oh, maybe this is something to be a little bit more open-minded about, because I mean, when you're immersed in all of this kind of talk and pop culture, it's hard to just like keep that at bay. Right. But so I really love the spirit of Blue Beetle.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's too derivative, and as I want to make sure that I get his name right, because I know the lead actor is from Cobra Kai. That's where he's, I guess, famous from. I've never seen an episode of Cobra Kai. That's one that I need to start watching because I've heard excellent things. But it's Xolo Maridueña.
Very nice.
And I like I like the idea of his character Jaime. I think he's got a great look. There's just something, and this extends to select cast members in this
Mhm.
film. They feel like they are not exactly overacting, but they're acting a little bit bigger than they need to,
Yes.
almost like this
Yes.
is a telenovela. I don't know if that's a stylistic thing or what, but it was very kind of soapy in parts, and he's a little bit too earnest and wide-eyed because
Mhm.
when we meet him, when the film, not exactly its opening, because the opening, of course, is this giant space scarab that rockets to Earth, and
Right.
I mean, it's the opening of Black Panther, right? There's this
Yep.
alien artifact that
Yep.
gives people powers and all this other stuff. And Susan Sarandon's character, she plays, what is her last name? Oh, Victoria Cord. She's the head of Cord
Yep.
Industries, multinational conglomerate. They want this scarab. They get it because they're going to try and create like super soldiers with it, because they're basically, among their other things, they're arms dealers. But when we meet the Reyes family, Jaime is coming home to it's like kind of like this fictitious sort of Miami community.
Right.
And he's coming from law school, and like the whole family get the feeling kind of sacrificed a lot so that he could go to school and like
Right.
be,
They can't make the
the
mortgage
big
because of
success.
it.
Right. And that's really touching. They don't say exactly what he was doing or where he was, but at one point he's wearing a Gotham Law hoodie, which is kind of a
Yes.
nice reminder that, oh, that's where he was studying,
Yeah,
law and
that's right.
everything. But there's just like, there's nothing about this character that screams like law student. I mean,
Right.
I watched
He's never like figures out something legally, or with the kind of brain that you have to have quick-witted wise in court that would suggest that, oh, that's right, he's pre-law, and he's got a pretty good head on his shoulders. I agree with you. He's a little too naive and a little bit too wide-eyed, innocent throughout to be believable. It's almost like he is a teenager, because in the original version of the Jaime character, he's a teen, which gets him very much in the Brian Michael Bendis sort of Spider-Man thing, where he's a complete fuck up, just like Peter Parker was when he wrote Ultimate Spider-Man. But here, he should be a little more savvy and a little more worldly than he is. But go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted your flow.
No, it's I was listening to another YouTuber named Vito. He did like an hour and a half review of this film. I certainly didn't watch. I watched a couple minutes of it because I was kind of interested in his take. And I think it was his co-host had said that this guy, I think his superpower is screaming, because he just does a lot of like no,
Right,
like, because
right.
the suit, the whole idea is this scarab, once it takes control of him, it melds to his body
Mhm,
like a symbiote, like Venom,
mhm,
like Upgrade,
mhm.
like this trope. I feel like this movie should have come out a decade ago, and maybe it would have had a chance. But all
Yeah.
of its cool whiz bang new ideas have been done half a dozen times in other
Mhm.
comic movies and universes. But this suit takes control. It's unpredictable. It has all these crazy weapon systems and does all these weird tests, like it takes him into orbit, which we saw in the trailer. But he is completely like not really in control of it pretty much throughout the film. Sometimes it
Mhm.
works, sometimes it
Right,
doesn't. Sometimes he's
right.
able to kind of suggest things and it kind of helps him out. But there's not really a hero's journey in this film. The suit is kind of the star, and even though it
Right,
does talk to him, it doesn't really have a personality. They don't really develop a bond, except that
right.
it kind of takes on his mantle of, I don't want to kill anybody, which is kind of nice. But it seems like there's all these sketches from other places that they
Mhm.
didn't really cohere into, okay, what are we going to say about these tropes? What are we going to do with them that people
Right.
aren't expecting? And it was kind of a letdown. I feel like Jaime as a character, given everything that we learn about him and his family at the beginning of the movie, just kind of gets shoved to the side because, hey, we got to have these cool action scenes where he's throwing these faceless, super cops around for 5 minutes. And I was completely like checked out.
Yeah. I understand that, and I can see that, that could be a take on it, definitely, because I think, the more I thought about it afterwards, as much as I enjoyed it, and like I said, I was charmed sort of by its certain modesties, it is pitched a little bit too broadly, and I thought the same thing too of, is it because of sort of, that's a little bit of the style of the sort of telenovela and some of that kind of the variety shows that go on for 4 hours on a Saturday night, and everything's a little bit poking the ribs and having fun and making sure that you're paying attention, and everybody's. It almost felt like this was sort of noisy because you've got to get past the noise of maybe the family at home watching it for those shows, and I think which is one of the reasons they're it pitched at such a level, or maybe because it goes on for 4 hours and they want to make sure you're awake. But I'm with you on that, and I think that's all very fair. And I mean, it's one of those movies where I think you could probably go between 2 stars and 3. But for me, I think because it was very family oriented, it was a sort of culture that, I, as a kid from Wisconsin, don't have firsthand knowledge of. I found a lot of that fun, and they also are kind of I don't want to say daring. That's maybe too strong a word, but they certainly make a lot of comments about immigration and sort of conspiracy theories, and they hit a couple of sort of the broad things. I mean, the George Lopez character doesn't trust the government and things. They're
Uncle
all
Rudy,
after him. Uncle Rudy and stuff like that. And is so broad, and George Lopez is, I mean, that's saying something because he's usually pretty broad in his stand-up and his shows that he's done. And here he's especially that because he's the wackadoo character. But I also like the sister and the fact that Susan Sarandon was bad, but she wasn't like chewing the scenery, and she was trying to be a little bit like, I'm not saying give a real performance, but it certainly, it wasn't like she was cackling like a fiend or thinking that, okay, now I have to do this sort of broad stuff. There was a few scenes where she's got big lines and, rather heavy-handed clunkers like, now you're mine and all that kind of crap. But I mean, she didn't oversell that. So, I mean, I think she was, and she, there was, she was pretty ruthless. I mean, some of the flashbacks they show and how she's sort of co-opting these people and stuff like that. It was like, wow, we're bringing in like, Central American problems and stuff like that from, the 80s and 90s and whatever. But for me, it just felt so familiar and yet different because it was given this casting and this sort of flavor that I found it made me feel buoyant. But to your bigger point, and Ian, I have to hand you credit for this because I think it's one of the problems with all this stuff is I'm not suggesting that the MCU or DC stop because they're not going to, but it would almost behoove them to say, we really have to take a look at what we're doing here because, and this may be true of just the way comic books in general work. I mean, I used to read them very religiously for many, many years, actually a few decades. And there are those boxes they check. I mean, it's almost like if you've ever read Andrew Snyder's Save the Cat books about screenwriting, and he frames how every story is kind of the same, and it has these 12
that shelf back there.
There you go. It has these 12 beats, and it's funny once you read that book, it's a little bit hard to watch movies because yes, even Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Godfather and the best classic movies, like damn, they all kind of have that formula. You only got 2.5 hours to tell a movie, and of course, you got to hit this beat, and you got to have the point of no return and the dark night of the soul and all those things. And this, especially with comic books, they hit those beats and you see them coming a mile away and they're coming. But because they kept the family connected to all of it, I thought that was interesting because he never really kind of goes away and does that. I've got a brood and, somebody's got to talk to me and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, they were kind of part and parcel of that unit through most of it. And that kept me going enough through it. But you're right. I mean, if you really examine this, and I'm sure in another month I'll look at this and go like, maybe I should have given that only 2.5 stars. But I, at the time when I'm sitting there, I was laughing. I was thinking it was funny. I was surprised at some of it. I thought the supporting cast came off pretty vividly and maybe too vividly in some respects, but at least that was better than like, I didn't like Ezra Miller much as the Flash. It's just like, oh, he's just really irritating me. And I think he was as broad as anybody here in a lot of respects, but maybe that's just how comic books are going now, where they're trying so hard to entertain and everything's big and pitched crazy, large anyway, excesses with the action and the CGI that maybe they figure that's where they go with the performances, and certainly enough of them have over the years. But
as there's a difference because I'm a big defender of the Flash, except for the god awful CGI, which is a giant hurdle to climb. I understand that. But the thing, and we kind of talking about the Flash. What I liked about Ezra Miller is yes, he has a very grating kind of persona, his version of Barry Allen. I haven't really cared for him, I don't think, in any of these Snyderverse films.
Right.
But what I liked is in The Flash, when he has to deal with a different version of himself, there is a modulation. There is a version
Yes.
of himself from the current day, when he's a little bit less annoying. He's kind of been around some of these adults, these Justice League people learning how to be heroic. Then he runs into the college loser version of himself, who's like up to 11, and he's like, oh, now I got to contend with this. I thought I love that kind of dynamic, because it wasn't just annoying Barry times 2. Here, it's strange, because I do want to take a bit of a sidebar, because this is something that bothered me throughout the film, and it has to do with what you're saying about like the kind of the Hispanic representation of the movie, which is a big selling point of this film. I'm trying to figure out how exactly to phrase this, because I was talking to my wife about this, and I don't think I came off a little clumsier than it was in my head. But the cultural touchstones that we get in this movie, I kind of feel like they're so broad and so ubiquitous in movies about Hispanic culture and TV shows and everything, that I can't tell where authenticity begins and white supremacy ends. Because it's like, if you were to ask somebody, some redneck, like, hey, what do you think of Mexicans? They'll be like, oh, they love tacos and they love Cheech and Chong and they love La Cucaracha.
Yeah.
And every household has illegal immigrants in it, like all this other stuff. I'm like, yeah,
lots of Jesus statues,
right? A lot, very religious. You've got an abuela who's got a secret past. I'm like, yeah, that's all in here. So I'm just wondering, I feel like culturally it's important for people to tell their stories, but after seeing the same things in the same stories over and over again, I start to wonder, well, what other stories do you have to tell?
No, it's an interesting point. I think it's a very fair one too. I think, for me, some of that still feels a little bit different, because you don't see it as much. You don't see as much representation. But yeah, they do hit some of the cliches that can't be every single family from Mexico and every experience. But in this case, it's sort of the one they went with, and maybe they might have, because it is familiar and it's easy to make some hay out of it and some laughs. I agree with that.
It does, it does feel broad, right?
And you're watching some of this, because it's a little bit like, that's not only kind of cliched, but maybe it's actually too cliched, and maybe that's also just too low hanging fruit. I like kind of, wouldn't it be, to your point, wouldn't it have been more interesting if, they liked listening to, Dave Brubeck instead, which would have been a little bit more interesting. Like, oh, okay, well, that's, something a little bit different or unexpected there, as opposed to some of those cliches that you hit. And then film it.
Right. And then like they, there's a bit where Susan Sarandon's character, Victoria Cord, of course, she's, very powerful, very wealthy, and extremely racist. She has this person working for her that who's a doctor who's kind of running all the tech to do the tests to basically harness the power of the Scarab to power these super cop, soldier machines, whatever. And she keeps calling him Sanchez.
Yeah,
and
she doesn't get his name right.
Right. And he's kind of mousy. He's like, actually, my name isn't Sanchez. And he's like, I don't care. Just go, type in the things to get me the code. And that happens like 2 or 3 times in the movie. And then at the end, of course, hold on, let me just throw up this banner, because we're wandering way far afield. At the end of the movie, he says, my name is not Sanchez. Oh, you okay?
Yeah, my phone just dropped. Sorry.
Okay. He screams at her. This is basically when and it's kind of a lovely, weird scene where he helps Jaime get out of this lab, because the mega super soldier Karapak, who's a very interesting character, who I think would have been, a great villain if we maybe gotten his origin story earlier than 10 minutes before the end of the film.
And you're kind of hoping he's going to get killed, but wait a minute, he's worth saving because of this or something, or at least given a redemption right before he meets his maker, right?
Right. And so many villains in movies nowadays, they're not really bad. They've all got this kind of sympathetic story. But what I liked about here, particularly with Karapak, is he does have that bit of an arc, but he realizes that he's kind of too far gone and he's lost everything, and he's spent his life in service of this other monster that, he very much he just drags Dr. Frankenstein off into a giant explosion. It's a really cool ending. And to your point earlier with Victoria Cord's kind of history with, this mega weapons corporation working with the government and helping to, do all these horrible things in other countries, it really does tie in nicely. I think if the movie had been more about that, is there a family-friendly way to make that movie? I'm not quite sure, but I think you could have, played around with it instead of this more of kind of a sitcom-y aesthetic.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, it really does have sort of a little bit of a sitcom-y aesthetic here, more, and they lean into that a lot because, I mean, all 5 of the family members are really on screen a lot, and
comically so, though, like they
comically so, and then and most of them, most of the movie is that. I mean, it's some decent action here, but even they're involved in the action, they're reacting to it. It's like, where did you go and what are you doing and where my roof and things like that,
well, first of all, this is going to help me get back to my point, Racketeer. Thank you. You say, I love that part where she always pronounced his name wrong. It's cute and everything, but at the end, when quote unquote Sanchez helps Jaime get out of this lab and he locks himself in with Victoria and Karapak because he thinks that it's going to blow and kill all of them, and he'll be the hero.
Right.
Of course, it doesn't end up that way, but he yells at Victoria because she's like, Sanchez, get us out of here, and he's like, my name is not Sanchez, it's this really long, like 5 or 6 name, right? Very Hispanic sounding, right? And it's a fine moment, and he unfortunately gets dispatched.
Right.
But at the end of the whole point of that was to show that Victoria's character is so racist that she doesn't bother to get his name right.
I know, it's a little.
Did you notice? Did you watch the end credits for this film? Did you pay attention?
You mean like just the scroll?
Yeah.
Not too close. Why, did I miss something?
Yeah. Dr. Sanchez is called Dr. Sanchez. No quotes around it.
Oh no.
It's just that Dr. Sanchez and the actor. So like if the whole point is like, this is all wrong because this character is terrible, and the quote unquote Dr. Sanchez is a real person who deserves dignity as a character.
Oh gosh.
We're not even, I would say even just like have that 6-letter name and then in parentheses like Dr. Sanchez in quotes or something, kind of make a nice little joke at the end, but they went this other direction. It was really strange.
That kind of sloppiness is, I mean, how does it get there? I mean, it's funny. I remember that the Hector Elizondo character is, I think, known as the concierge in the credits of Pretty Woman, and yet his name is spoken a number of times. And it's like, really? How do they not catch that when they're doing test screenings or double checking everybody's spelling for an end credit? And that's a whole different department that just even does that. I mean, I don't know. Those kind of things.
Well, especially
since that's the joke, and they make the same offense that the Susan Sarandon Cord character makes, which is just so bad. It's almost underlining it see, we made this film and she's supposed to be bad for it, but we're guilty of it ourselves, right? Because we're just as racist and we're just as unforgiving and oblivious.
Or sloppy, I guess. Racketeer also says, I did not catch that as well. Maybe with the strike there.
I love this guy. Bring him on. We need a third. That's hilarious. That's really good. Well, and go ahead. No, but I mean, it's funny. I think one of the things, Ian, and I don't mean to, take away the onus of the mistakes or things that this film could have been better. I mean, you could argue, as I think a lot of these movies, especially these days, that they're too much by rote and they're often predictable, and you just wish that somebody had gone through that laptop one more time through the typewriter to just say, tighten up the jokes or find something that makes this a little bit more unusual or interesting or whatever else. And maybe this is one of those where I walked into the theater not expecting so much, so I was pleasantly surprised that I was entertained and found a lot of it funny. But I think if anything, I think this movie, unfortunately, is sort of sacrificed on the altar of, okay, not only have we exhausted superhero movies, but they're become so predictable that when we try to do new things with them, either we can't, we don't, or they still feel the same, even though some of the parts of it have a novelty to them like this one, which is really a cast of virtual unknowns and the family unit taking most of the story. But yeah, I mean, you know, I thought it was funny too at the end when they finally sort of took off his helmet. And it's like, because this is the problem that Jon Favreau was dealing with from the beginning of Iron Man. It's like, okay, I've now got a superhero that I never see. So he came up, or somebody came up with a way, maybe it's right out of the comic books. I didn't read Iron Man back in the day. But, you know, they show Robert Downey's face in tight close-up, and that's him inside the thing. But it's funny when you watch that. I watched that about 2 years ago. And it's like, wow, he's not in that movie a lot. It's a lot of that suit. You know, I mean, that's why the first hour is so good at that, where they set him up, because once he's in that suit, it's all CGI. And same here. And then they finally, you know, destroy half the mask. You see him, which is what they did with Peter Parker at the end of the first Spider-Man.
Oh, yeah, there's
all those. You can just see the YouTube stuff where they're going to. You brought up last week with you know, the Alien 3 and some of those kind of things. I mean, they're going to do even more of that here, where, you know, you can literally count the 40 references to other films that this movie directly steals from, pays homage to.
Right. I mean, there's that scene, I think it's at the end of the first Raimi Spider-Man, where Peter Parker is down. I think the Goblin is on top of him or something.
Yeah.
It's that classic shot of like the mask is half ripped
yes,
off.
Which they always used to have in the Stanley.
Up.
Yeah,
they do that with Blue Beetle here,
Yep.
almost the exact same shot. It's very
Yep.
strange. During the flashback where you see Karapax's origin, you know, I think there's a bomb that blows up his mom, and then when he's like in the wreckage or whatever, you see Cord Industries on like some of the wreckage, or some of the, I guess the casing of one of the bombs that didn't detonate. That's straight out of the opening of Iron Man.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just yikes.
And it's also people who are making the films today have short-term memories. It's not just it's not necessarily casual disregard. I'm not even sure they even know. I mean, or they may think that, oh, we'll do this, and it's like, well, there's this movie, there's that movie, and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe they do and they just cynically don't care, thinking that the audience won't remember. And maybe a lot of them don't. But I think it's just all too much of that. I think it's all too much of kind of the same thing. And even, you know, like the voice talking to him, that's Jarvis. But you're right. It's not a bad personality, because, you know, she says some funny things to him. But you can imagine if they gave that to a really good actor and made it more of a big deal as a role, what that could have been. I mean, they've got David Tennant in the new Ahsoka thing, you know, and they love to put the sort of uptight Brits as the droids in these things. But, you know, he gets a couple of good lines off, and, you know, all in that sort of Stephen Fry, you know, Juster and Wooster and Jeeves or whatever it was, style of, you know, the sort of knowing British haughty butler who really knows more than the men of the house. And, you know, there could have been some of that.
That was almost a good John Gielgud you had there.
It was a John Gielgud. Do you remember that line in Murder on the Orient Express about what are you doing? I'm reading a book. Is it about sex? No, it's about 10 o'clock. Anyway, it was such a low-hanging fruit line there, but it was funny in that movie at the time. But thank you for thinking I'm doing John Gielgud. But yeah, they could have done a little bit more with that. I mean, I think it's kind of funny when she finally starts talking and he's saying like, well, show me what else I could do. And no, that isn't good. And I need this. And there's panic, which sounds sort of amusing. But again, one more time through the typewriter, I think that character would have been more interesting and fascinating, and been could have been a parody of Surrey, could have been a parody of Jarvis, could have been, you know, it doesn't have to be a British voice either. It could have been somebody else. I mean, what if it's you know, Sofia Vergara, for God's sake? You know, I mean, they could have given her a funny role, and she could have mangled the language and been funny as well. But it's good enough in some respects, and maybe that in this day and age seems good, and maybe I'm guilty of that as well as a critic. But my expectations were not great on this one, and I did find it amusing. As I sat there, I was kind of charmed by it. But in hindsight, as we talk about it here on your program, a lot of it is derivative and lackluster. Well, sorry, damn it, Ian. I think I've just lost the debate.
It's not a debate. Again, I'm coming into this. This is not Barbie or Barbenheimer 2.0.
That's right. Ian did not have any reaction to this, although it sounds pretty much like it's a negative one.
Well, here's the thing. It's not negative because Yeah, the movie just I don't feel like it took enough chances for I wasn't completely bored because I was sitting there thinking about how I've seen all this stuff before, but also like almost every decision I was like, if they just done this instead, or dial this down a bit, or amp this up a bit. It's almost like I'm engineering in a music studio or something, trying to take the raw material and kind of perfect it in my brain. I was engaged the entire time, except when I checked out during the fight scenes, because those were, very cookie cutter. But about this symbiote, I mean, to your point, yeah, they could have done something funnier or whatever with his voice, but I think the screenwriters, and maybe this has to do with the comics. I never read the Blue Beetle comics. I know there are different incarnations of the character, which they kind of touch on in this movie. But the whole point of this is that it is an alien intelligence that has chosen to bond with Jaime Reyes. And there in the talk about Ted Cord, who is the mysteriously disappeared brilliant scientist, ex-husband of Victoria Cord, who was the second Blue Beetle in this reality from like the 90s, who was a tinkerer and a superhero and all that stuff. He was obsessed with the Scarab as well, but the Scarab did not choose him. It chose someone else that he knew and kind of like studied and all this other stuff. But it's an alien intelligence. You never get that sense. There's never really a conversation of like, what do you want with me? What do you want with humanity? Why did you choose me? It's just like, I can make any kind of weapon that you want. And there's nothing in Jaime that's like, why are you so obsessed with making weapons? Like, maybe there should be like a conflict. Like, no, I'd like to use these to help people. I don't want to kill people. You keep trying to make these weapons. That's not going to be. Can it change the alien product? Because this is not ostensibly a machine like Jarvis was, an AI that Tony Stark wrote. It is a thing with is somewhat sentient, at least, or maybe it's not. They don't explain. Is this an alien robot? Is it an alien? What is it?
Well, you just raised an interesting point that I think would have added more appropriate and sort of fresher comedy to it. Like, what if he had his fists to avoid sort of hurting or killing people dramatically into like a spray hose, or something that would been funnier. So they're splattered up against the wall, almost like something out of a Buster Keaton Keystone Cops kind of comedy or something. I mean, there could have been some funny, very funny, or like it just becomes foam, and suddenly they're lost in suds or foam or something like that. I mean, there could have been some more play, like if this can really create this because it's so intelligent and can sort of conjure very, very and that's very Green Lantern, isn't it? Because the Green Lantern ring was always doing these things.
And there's a missed opportunity here too, because there's not only the Gotham Law thing, but in the establishing shots of this city, you see right behind the Cord building is a LexCorp building. So Lex Luthor exists in the reality, and he's also an industrialist and all this other business. But it would have been cool if someone had made reference to the Green Lanterns, because this is the same universe that Green Lantern exists in, with a similar DC power to create and all this other business. Would it be great if Uncle Rudy had said like, oh, your suit reminds me of this thing I saw on the dark web about this guy that had a ring that could do anything, or just some kind of a little thing just to let us know that this really is a lived-in universe, and maybe open up the imagination to say, is the Scarab connected to the Lanterns? Is the Lantern Corps the enemy of the Scarab people, whoever they are? Like, what's going on here?
And even if you want to do sort of meta kind of jokes, then I mean, it might have been funny. He goes like, I can't remember what his name was, but he looked kind of like that guy, that Deadpool guy, that kind of thing. I mean, just and throw it away. I mean, and Lopez can throw it away. But I will say this, and it's a question that you raise, and I think it's a really good one, not just for sort of the expectations, and I think studio heads and maybe producers or whomever is kind of saying, we have to do this, we have to do that. I mean, to your point, you said you checked out during some of the action scenes. These went faster. I thought they were a little more efficient. There was a little more efficiency to this film. It was much shorter. It didn't seem to wear out its welcome. I know it had things that you weren't fond of and predictable and kind of snoozy for you. But I'm just wondering if there is this committee, if you will. I know we always talk about these things as committee made, and we talk about that in advertising and how many clients are deciding things, et cetera in the world. But that you have to do this and you have to do that. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why I think not only is this very predictable on those levels, which again, well, if you're going to do superhero, you have to do the action thing, and you have to have this, and it has to do that, and you have to have him defeat a whole army. It's not enough that he can only defeat one person. And we're going to have one last rug pull. The main henchman is actually kind of sympathetic, kind of like the way they saved the Richard Kiel character of Jaws at the end of Moonraker. He turns into a good guy and helps James Bond a little bit, even though he was trying to bite his face off in Spy Who Loved Me. But also, to your point, and when you said, you're wondering about the broadness of it, and I was saying, well, there's certain parts of Hispanic television and Mexican television is very broad and definitely likes to kind of goose and stuff. But I will tell you this, now that I'm thinking of it, and you've sort of made me think of some other things. When I saw the movie Cantinflas, which was in Spanish, about the history of that famous Mexican comedian who became a big star in Hollywood in the early 60s and then kind of went back to Mexico to make movies. There was definitely a feel to that they wanted to make it for white audiences if they were going to dub it. And the one version that they had here, that it was not dubbed as much as I thought it was going to be. So there were certain parts of it I was kind of lost to. But again, I felt this weird tension between like, wow, this is kind of this authentic Mexican biography with some really good cast members and really a concentration on that. There was really only one white sort of character in it. And that was Mike Todd, I think, who was pushing him to do Around the World in 80 Days. But I felt the same when I watched the One Day at a Time reboot on Netflix with Rita Moreno, and they updated the Bonnie Franklin sitcom that Norman Lear did in the 70s to be a Hispanic family. It's very broad, and you feel like we have to make this accessible to the average Joe, i.e. the average white person who's watching this, because otherwise it's too niche and we can't have that as our audience. And I think to some degree here, to your point, they hit sort of those cliches that the average Joe in the audience will nod there and go, oh, I recognize that. Yeah, everybody knows that. It's like, well, but it's such a cliche, but they're hitting them anyway. And I've noticed that sometimes when they do that with, movies and shows that don't have as much representation as they should. And yet they're trying to mainstream them. They mainstream them into the things that everybody can kind of nod and recognize. And then it ends up almost hurting it because it feels less specific and more sort of homogenized for everybody to kind of get, when the whole intent was to sort of broaden the tent and bring in a new audience and a new perspective and everything else.
You just open up a door for me, a possibility I hadn't considered, and I apologize, folks. I don't, some of my comments earlier might come off as offensive to some, and I don't mean to be. I'm trying to approach these things, with a cultural sensitivity, because I'm not of the target demographic for this film. But I was kind of assuming that a lot of these kind of cliche things that we talked about beforehand, I asked, like, is this all there is? Because this seems to be ubiquitous in a lot of these, Hispanic targeted shows. But to your point, Jeff, I'm wondering if any of this is getting kind of filtered through, and I don't want to make assumptions about who's running these studios either, because
Right.
There's a big push for diversity in like the kind of the upper echelons of these studios and networks and stuff. But could there be like, what, we need to make this more accessible to everybody, so let's would it be cool if they played La Cucaracha and someone could be like, really? And like, yeah, they'll love it. So maybe they kind of these decisions to try and like push that broadness that the original intent was, like, we want to tell a more authentic story, and an authentic story does not necessarily have to have fucking La Cucaracha in it. I'm reminded of, I think it was an ABC sitcom, like a dramedy com a few years ago. I think it was pre-pandemic and only lasted maybe a season. I don't know if it even got to. It was called Beauty and the Baker, and it was,
I've heard of it. Yeah,
it was really good. It was, my wife kind of roped me into it. I'm like, I'll watch it. But it's about this, female Hispanic pop star who falls in love with like a local Hispanic baker, close to his family, works at the family bakery and all this stuff. And he gets pulled into this world of like Hollywood and fame and everything. There's struggles there. And that was, I don't remember it much specifically, but I remember watching it and thinking, I don't feel like I've heard this story told this way before. And it's not littered with all these, tropes that you expect, like we're talking about, are littered throughout Blue Beetle. I guess I'm just struggling, or just eager to watch these stories that feel like they just didn't come off of a generic assembly line.
Well, you also, I think that is probably it, and I'm not even going to be too hard on the studio execs for the simple fact that I think they were probably wanting it to be as accessible, especially they're spending $100 million on this, which is still like half the budget of most of these things.
Yeah.
But they still want an audience. I also think as I watch it, and maybe this is because a lot of the people I saw it with. I didn't see the critic screen of it. I was busy at work that day, and I was couldn't get away at night. But I saw it a Saturday morning, and there were a lot of kids in the audience, and and parents with their kids. And I my first thought, and then I kind of just didn't think about it until just now, is I wonder if they were wanting to make this a little bit more family friendly. And I know that you'd sort of like that probably from all this stuff, but if there was a little bit more of a conscious decision to make the jokes a little more accessible to them that they can understand, or underline things a little bit. I mean, I think they do that throughout all these things these days anyway. But that may be part of it too. I think, this is one of those things where, hey, we're taking a risk here. We're going with unknowns, and even Susan Sarandon isn't a draw anymore per se, and everybody knows Lopez, but and he's in the funniest sort of support character, but the main leads, the two younger people and his sister, are virtual unknowns, other than the credits that you mentioned. And I think when you do some of those risky things that I'm sure for studios are risky, like, oh my God, this is, there's no stars and there's no big names and blah, blah, blah. We're not even going to bring in cameos from, whomever. They probably figured that on some of the other stuff, they had to work a little harder to maybe make it a little bit more universal. And in some respects, I think that brings those cliches from the comic book world back in vogue, and almost too strong, as well as makes for some of it music cues, some jokes. Of course, it's always, nobody can have a house without some illegal alien in it, right? Illegal immigrant these days. It's like, God, are we really leaning into that? Pretty hard. Yeah, we are. And they have their cake and eat it too. They lean into that. But then, of course, they're it's sort of an innocent thing, or grandma's a badass and she's capable of Grambo, as you said. I can't believe they didn't make that joke. See, that would have been one that if they put it one more time through that typewriter, they might have come up with. But the whole thing is, I think you feel this push and pull between some of the novelty and the charm, and then some of the obviousness and some of the lower hanging fruit that gets a little bit irritating.
Yeah, I definitely feel that too. It's a very compromised movie because you're right. I do feel it's a bit broad, and kind of in the sense that it could be, more of a not a little kids movie, because I think there's too many dick jokes in it.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly preteen, teen audience. It doesn't have, we are in the far end of this. We're far away from the Snyderverse now.
Oh, yeah,
we are firmly in like Aquaman, even Shazam territory. Shazam,
totally Shazam.
This
very
is
much.
this is I didn't see Fury of the Gods because I think that was when I was still on my moratorium. But I know they leaned more into the whole family are superheroes now.
Yeah,
and that's kind of a cool idea. But in here, it's like, the family is involved, even if they don't all have powers. I do want to pull over for a second because we have touched on a few comments from Mr. Racketeer. Darth Vader and Obi-Wan, the same with Hayden. Yes, you're referring to the ripped mask kind of thing.
Yes.
And I will give it points, even though they kind of ripped off from a later season of Rebels, I think, that scene where you've got the Darth Vader mask and the ripped face. But they did do something effective where you hear the Darth Vader voice and Anakin Skywalker's voice talking at the same time.
Yeah,
it's
mixing
like that,
in like he's
even
his voice is conflicted.
Right, but that's the thing. I'm fine with cliches as long as you do something with them. Like, hey, you've seen this 1,000 times, but you've never seen it like this. Let's see. Andy Serkis would have been my vote to voice the Scarab. That would have been fun.
Racketeer, you're a good. We should have you heading up a studio, making some good calls here.
Let's see. Okay, sorry. I think I froze and came back. My internet's been a little spotty tonight.
Oh, okay.
And then Racketeer also said, would you have recast the unknowns for more of a billboard, Jeff? So I guess like more marquee names.
No, I wouldn't have. In fact, that's what I liked about it, because I didn't have really any expectations of who they were. I think the characters had to come through because I didn't bring, the essence of that actor to it, which I think was very good. So I would not have done that way. In fact, that's one of the things I liked about this, that I that felt fresh to me. That felt sort of define expectations, because even as we've talked about some of the cliches tonight, the fact that those people were in it and I didn't know anything about them much, and they seem like interesting, fresh faces to me, I think helps this kind of stuff a lot. I find that oftentimes is more effective in films, because sometimes you put too much of the actor in it, and they're not going to end up in these kind of roles necessarily, and that and the other thing. But if it's somebody who just seems to be that character to me because I don't know who the actor is, I kind of buy into it a little bit more, and I think there's always something to be said for that. And like when I first watched Euphoria, which I know is a very polarizing show on HBO, I'd never seen any of those people before other than Zendaya. And she was so different. It was like, oh my God, she's such a bad girl in this. And everybody else was like, who are these people? What great casting. I think it won the Emmy that year for casting, because you put in these talented people you've never seen before, and they just are the characters to you. You just watch them, and you don't sit there and go like, oh, this is, this actor slumming or playing against type because, whatever. And there's charms in that, but I love the star machinery too. But,
well, yeah, there is
but
something.
But to your original question, Racket, no, I wouldn't have. I would have kept the unknowns.
Yeah, and I would have too. I think this, having George Lopez and Susan Sarandon and just a couple of bigger players is perfect, because there is something I think about superhero movies that it's nice to discover things. Not only
Right.
hopefully new characters, but
Yes.
also new actors. Because if you look back at the MCU, yeah, Robert Downey Jr. was a big star, but he'd also disappeared and reinvented himself for half a decade or a decade or more, to the point where the headlines were so much a part of his identity that people, I think, forgot that he was a really good actor and he could do some surprising things, like with a Tony Stark character. Same with Chris Hemsworth, who was kind of an unknown. Chris Evans, who had done a couple of comedies at that point to become the iconic Captain America. So yeah, I agree. As much as I critiqued Xolo's kind of take on the character, I think that with a different script and a different direction, they could have probably toned that down. One question, I think you really could have done something with this film and taken a risk. When they're putting it together, I don't know that they could have known that this was going to be one of the last trains out of the station before they rebooted everything. But imagine what would happen, because they keep, it's almost like a rule of three thing, where they keep referring to the fact that the Scarab has to choose people, and the Scarab actually skipped over this person, really wanted the power, and chose someone else.
Right.
Imagine if the Scarab took over Jaime, and throughout the course of the film, he almost had an Anakin Skywalker type of an arc, where he started using this power that he was granted and using these weapons, and got a little bit out of control, and became the wrong kind of superhero, doing the right things the wrong way. And if the end, when we know about Karapak's troubled origin, the super villain of the piece, what if the Scarab chose Karapak and he had to team up with this alien force to take down the Blue Beetle and then assume the mantle of the Blue Beetle at the end of the picture? I don't know if you would have done that, because Karapak
that would have been
a
very
40-year-old man, but yeah.
And that would have been very edgy. But I mean, even to your original thought is you can imagine, maybe there would be a key point where he'd want his powers and the Scarab would be holding back because he was not believing in his choice. And then suddenly, Hermé had to, kind of, Hermé, like he's a scarf. He had
Hermes, yes. No.
Hermes, yeah. he had to sort of rein it in, to your point, say, hey, you know what? I don't get this power unconditionally now. I have to be kind of earning it in a way, which I think Jaime would have been better, sort of having that kind of revelation. It certainly would have given a little bit more an arc, rather than, hey, he's just continuing to build sort of up his power and his ability to manipulate the Scarab in the suit, but to have sort of an existential crisis and how he's using it, because again, it's a lot of power in his hands, and he could have maybe gone a little apeshit with it, and maybe that would have been bad. I think you're right, Ian. I think what you're wanting to do is something that has a little bit more, for lack of a better term, but it's a good word, intelligence to it. And I think these things are a little bit more straight down the pike kind of stuff, where they don't want to zig or zag too much, and they probably figure they were really zigging over here just by the fact that it's unknowns and it's Hispanic actors, etc. I'll tell you one thing and just to bring in a quick little thought, and I know this is maybe getting ahead of ourselves, but it's interesting because we got the critics screening of the 2 first episodes of Ahsoka, and most of the reviews have been very good, but the reviews that have not been particularly praised were these, it's dull and it's boring, and it doesn't go anywhere. And I completely disagree with that. I'm not saying, well, I'm the right critic on this, but they're doing a Western, and Ahsoka is doing The Man with No Name. And it's funny because Rosario Dawson has this very active face and these arched eyebrows. And I always think of her like how she just was deliciously lascivious in Sin City. And she's this kind of bright-eyed and this huge grin. It's almost, it's
the iconic. I think it was one of the character posters where she was doing the thing with her tongue. It was like,
yes. Oh my God. She's
yeah.
just, I mean, she's big and funny and sexy and all this stuff. And here she's like very stoic. And the show, in those parts that some critics thought were dull or boring, are where she's sitting and waiting. Like she doesn't have to show her powers. Like when she actually gets out the double sabers and she's ambidextrous and does it happens very quickly and it's done. But she's most interesting when she's laying in wait, almost like the cat that doesn't have to pounce and is looking around and waiting. And sort of that's what I think they did. If you watch the old Clint Eastwood Man with No Name stuff, he does very little shooting in it. It's mostly him like, are you going to piss me off? Because I'll break this cement face if you do. And that's what they've got going here a little bit. And I kind of loved it. It felt very Western, also, a little bit of Shane and some of these other things. But of course, to the critics out there, it's like, oh, this is boring. Nothing happens. I need excitement for the entire hour of Star Wars. This is the stuff I've been weaned on and I can't get off it. It's an addiction. And that kind of bothers me. And I think you see some of that here. Like, well, we have to have a big battle. We have to have all hands on deck. We have to have things destroyed. I mean, how many movies have we seen? And one of the biggest criticisms of Man of Steel is, why did you have to destroy the whole city? And he won't kill Zod, but he lets all these buildings come down, which maybe people are in them. That doesn't make any sense. So, but nobody's learned that lesson since then, whether it's Star Trek or all these other superheroes. We got to destroy everything. And they come kind of close here where they're destroying the whole lair, of course, which is very James Bond too. But I think it's interesting that it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the studios say we have to do these because that's what we do in these movies. And then when they try to do something a little bit different, like having Rosario Dawson rein in her lasciviousness and her sort of big expressive face, and she becomes very stoic. Oh, it's boring. We don't like that new. We want it the old way. We want it all just razzle dazzle and whatever. And so you can't win, I guess. But
my main criticism that I've heard of Ahsoka, and I haven't watched it because I haven't caught up on Rebels, and that's the point, is like a lot of it is, from what I understand, if you're not familiar with Rebels, it's going to be kind of hard to get onto that wavelength, and maybe that's what people are responding to. They're bored because they don't understand.
Or maybe they know all that stuff before, and they don't want this one to sort of, for lack of a better term, spoon feed it a little bit slower to people who aren't watching everything in the lore. I mean, I think one of the smart things that maybe Favreau and crew are doing with all these things now is they're sort of trying to start them where you don't have to have all of the nerd lore to know every last second of everything that's been in the Star Wars universe to understand where the show is. They can start it from a point where, okay, we're going to explain the Sabine character. We're going to explain the general character and a little bit more of a, for the novice or maybe somebody who's coming in, not totally into it.
Well, I don't know.
Anyway, you'll see it, and we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah, I'm not covering Ahsoka. We'll talk about it when I finally catch up.
Okay, sure.
Over a breakfast.
But I'm just the illustration point is that I think it's sometimes who do you? It's the story of the man and the donkey and his son going into town, and well, you should let your son ride the donkey. No, you should let your father ride the donkey, and well, you neither. Because you can't please anybody all the time.
Yeah. Well. Racketeer also writes in to say, similar to a Samaritan plotline. I assume you're talking about my idea for the whole like Karapak's reversal. Samaritan, is that referring to the Sylvester Stallone Amazon thing that came out last year? I didn't watch that, but I know that was supposed to be like a new take on, or his take on superheroes.
I didn't see it either.
I can't speak to that, but if that is, then if that is similar to, and he's saying yes. So if that is similar, then I'll have to go check out the Samaritan. It sounds like so very cool.
But I think Racketeer is demonstrating, where is that push and pull between something that's been done before, something that people like that's been done before, and something that's like you're suggesting, a little more radical or different. But I'm sure the studio said, "Oh my God, we're going with unknowns, and this is, all about a Mexican American family. Holy shit! Well, we better make some of these things recognizable for everybody else." I'm sure.
Right. And again, I would like to see a better version of this movie, but we have to deal with the movie that we got, and that's fine, I guess. And it's strange because I am. Oh well, hold on. Exactly, Jeff.
Oh,
All
well,
right.
thank you, my friend, my new best friend. I love him. Come back for more.
But it's funny because I talked to David Fowley the other night about a movie that's coming out this week on Friday called Retribution, starring Liam Neeson.
Yes.
And it's a movie. It's very strange. I recommend folks out there who are watching this, if you can stand to spend another hour with me, go watch the Retribution conversation, because in that movie, I defend the full 90 minutes of it being completely cliched and like everything else that I've seen. And David hated it because it's completely cliched
That's
and like
hilarious.
everything else he's seen. But the key difference is, and not to give everything away, but you can do a lot with performance and the kind of the context in which this cliched setting is playing out that can give you a lot of, sorry to say, mileage, because that's a pun involving the plot of the movie, where that can help you like recognize, yes, I've seen this before, but I'm curious as to where this filmmaker is taking this idea, because this seems a little bit unfamiliar territory. But yeah, so any kind of closing thoughts on Blue Beetle? We didn't get into a whole lot of specifics. Oh, there's one other thing I want to mention. Sorry, Jeff.
No, please.
This isn't a superhero movie. I just want to tell you that. Did you notice that he's got like one scene where he's out in public, really, when he's first getting the suit, and like he flies up into orbit, comes back down, the whole trailer thing where he slices the bus in half. There's these stoners that see him, but everything else is like contained to, I got to save my family from their house, at night from this Cord Industries raid. Now we're going to this secret island lair, and now we're going to this abandoned mansion.
Nobody really knows who he is yet.
Right. There's no like, I'm going to go out and like save puppies from trees, or,
he doesn't feel the lure of like a greater calling to what he should be doing or could do with this. You're right. It's again, it's kind of very contained and kind of a modest little thing that keeps it very centralized and very family focused for good, and maybe not so good. But no, that's true. I think what this is pointing to, and again, you've been a champion of this for years now, is I think the DCEU and the MCU and anybody who's going into these franchise kind of mentality things really has to think about what they're doing. Now you can say, well, the proof is in the money, and all these things are beloved, and you know how much it costs to start something that's new. And then you look at something like Barbie, which yes is borrowed interest from something we all know, but it's a novelty, a different film, and it makes a ton of money. But I think they have to find a way to try to make these things appealing. But I think fresh and new can be appealing. Give that a shot rather than ticking all these boxes. It's not enough to just say, we're going to tell this one with a Mexican American skew. That's great. That's a great start, and there's a lot of good things in here because of that. But that doesn't mean that everything else then sort of ticks the same 8 boxes, even if Mr. Snyder is telling us that ultimately we kind of do that in Save the Cat. But his whole argument for that book is you don't notice it because writers and filmmakers find different ways to do that, where, yes, the conventions of time and narrative and up and down and hero's journey will be met. But if you can find fresher ways to do them, Jaws and Fatal Attraction are the same movie, as he argues, and they are the same beats, but you wouldn't know that they're the same movie when you watch them, because they find clever ways to disguise the fact that they're hitting the same beats of the monster in the house trope. I just think that, and then I've said before, and I'll just champion my own thing here, I think the key to the superhero world as we continue on with this are self-contained one-offs. My article has not come out yet, but I'm tired of everything having to fit in together. And then, this one has a sequel, so we have to get to one. It's a good sequel potential if they were ever going to do it. Find out what happened to the dad character. I mean, it comes right out of this story. It doesn't feel derivative. But do I need that here? Is it not enough that I can just contain and conclude the story? Does nothing never conclude anymore? I think they have to start doing that, and in doing so, they won't have to keep setting everything up and making it all so interacts and works with everything else in the universe. I think those things are part of the reason there are those cliches, and they all start to feel by committee or by rote.
Right. And I will say, I've been kind of, to your point, Jeff, I said I didn't really have much reaction to this, but I've been kind of negative on it. But I will say there is a scene in the third act, and we have the spoiler tag on, so be warned.
Yeah.
Jaime's father, during this raid by the Cord Industries on the Reyes family's home, his dad has a heart attack and dies, and Jaime isn't there for it. He's being captured and taken away in a helicopter and being separated from his family. It's very dramatic. But later on, he visits, or his father's kind of ghost visits him, which again is right out of Black Panther. I'm going to go into this like pseudo spirit world waiting room and talk to my dead relative. But damn it, that scene got to me.
Yeah.
I think the dad was it's Damien Alcazar. I feel like I've seen him before. I don't know where though, but he was so good in this, again, a very cliched role, the hardworking dad who just wants the best for his son. And, they kind of have a couple of heart to hearts, but they're very well written and excellently performed heart to heart moments. I got a little bit choked up. And even when Jaime is leaving that kind of spirit world, he's running away from kind of his neighborhood, which is out in the cosmos, and it's crumbling. He's reaching up towards the suit, and that's kind of mirroring what's going on in the real world. I'm like, give me 2 hours of this and not this other, La Cucaracha nonsense.
No, that's a great point. I'm totally with you. And that's where I think sort of more of understanding of where the emotional touch points are. Again, like that, and using the family and having the sister be a main character. I mean, she was a main character. She just wasn't the throwaway, oh, she's the smart aleck and that's the end of it. No, she's crying in scenes, and she kind of has her own arc, and she has some big scenes as well in it. Those are really terrific, and they should lean into more of those, because to your point, that was a very moving scene. And even if that's been done before, that kind of thing plays. It's very effective. So we'll see. I mean, I think James Gunn has his work cut out for him. I think the folks at the MCU have to be wondering what the heck they're going to do. We'll see. I mean, I think this Loki TV series is going to be very telling on the second season of that one, what's going to happen there. And sort of, does it just retread, same material in the same field again, or is it find a way to say, oh, there's something a little bit unexpected with it? Because I think we are too aware now of what all this is, and it's become very hard to surprise and please us.
Yeah, and I think folks kind of get the wrong idea about critics sometimes, and because we can be a little bit snarky and a little bit rude in some of our commentary, but we go into these things hopeful. We want to be entertained. We want to believe. We love the magic of movies. That's why we got into this. And so when things kind of fall short of that, or they don't live up to the potential of, like, some of us are sitting there thinking, if you gave me $250 million to make a movie, come on.
But it's funny though, Ian, because to your point, I mean, when I went in on Saturday morning, it was mostly kids. I'm not going to presume to say I felt like a kid, but I think that guileless laughter and that sort of probably buoyed me in ways that, at that point I was a little bit more of an audience who was enjoying it, as opposed to somebody with my critics hat on. And sometimes I think, to your point, there's movies that we watch, as maybe even the Liam Neeson movie you just mentioned, where you're saying, oh my God, I mean, I really would have trouble defending this outright as a critic who's supposed to be looking for the intellectual je ne sais quoi to it all. But sometimes it's just like, hell, I want to see people get, mown down and or dirty, or say crazy things, or fall all over themselves, or be charming and make me cry when he's talking to his ghost dad or whatever. And that can be sometimes just fine.
Well, thank you for indirectly referencing Ghost Dad, the Bill Cosby comedy from 1990.
I can't believe you even remember that, because he tried his damnedest to make sure nobody ever remembered that. In fact, I think he drugged them so they would not remember it.
Wow. That's what this whole thing was, just trying to erase Ghost Dad.
There we go.
Wow. On that note, Jeff, thank you very much. We got a couple of things, a little bit of housekeeping to do before we wrap up tonight. First, I want to give a shout out to everyone who tuned in, and now for the live and in the future, especially the MVP of this episode, besides you, Jeff, of course, is Racketeer.
Yes, we love them.
Thank you very much for hanging out. We loved you, Racketeer. I don't want to assume if you were a guy or a girl or whatever, I'm assuming it's, but whatever. I don't know why I'm saying that, but anyhow.
We appreciate you. You were great. You helped the show immensely. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Good thoughts.
Next week, join us back here, same time, 8 p.m. Central Time Wednesday. We are going to be doing a new series. Well, we're going to do a pilot. We'll see if it goes to series, as they say in the biz.
Wow.
I mean, I have high hopes for it, and it's my show, so damn it, we're going to make it a series. But Jeff, it's something that you pitched to me. We were kind of talking about over breakfast a couple weeks ago. It's called If You Like, Then You'll Love. Now, I still have to figure out, and maybe we'll figure this out during the course of the show, which is the like and which is the love. But we're going to be talking about Gran Turismo, the new movie based on the real life story of a kid who got to race real race cars after becoming a champion Gran Turismo video game player. I've seen it. I'm going to see it again this weekend with my family. I love this movie. And I'm excited to talk about it. We're going to be talking about that. If you like Gran Turismo, then you'll love The Last Starfighter from 1984, I believe. I think it turns 40 next year. Very similar kind of films in ways that you might not obviously expect, but I think it's going to be worth talking about. I'm going to be talking about it with you, Jeff, next week, and possibly some other folks too.
The great Robert Preston, one of his last roles, if not his last role. I'm not sure about that, but he was in The Last Starfighter.
Wow. Was that his last bit?
I'd have to look that up, but I think it might have been his major. I think maybe he did some TV stuff, but anyway, yeah. But I love that you remember that film, because that was a very well done movie that shouldn't be forgotten. I think it has probably a cult status, but it should be remembered more. So that'll be a fun discussion, and maybe it'll create other things like that. Either that, or you have to start bringing me in to talk about movies from the 70s that you're discovering.
Well, we're definitely, I do like this If You Like, You'll Love, because we constantly talk about, on this show, or even just more kind of hanging out talking about things, influences, and how this movie reminds me of this movie, or these themes were done better back in the 70s or whatever. So that might be a way to kind of spotlight a current film, but also to bring some attention to maybe a forgotten, like a cult film, or hell, maybe I suppose one of these days we could do a movie that came out in 2023 and another movie that came out in 2023. I don't know what that would look like, but we can go anywhere with the series.
Sure.
And then also, I mentioned I'm going to see this again this weekend. I'm going on Sunday, which is National Cinema Day or National Movie Theater Day. I've heard it a couple of different ways. So yeah, you can just like Google it, and I'll see if I can find some information to drop below. But yeah, a bunch of theater chains and movie theaters across America, including AMC and Regal, are doing $4 movie tickets on Sunday. And from what I can tell, I don't know if this applies to IMAX, but I know like you can go at my local AMC, you can get the fancy leather reclining seat auditorium, or the regular, just like kind of comfy auditorium. $4, all the same. And that includes, they're going to have like deals on like snack combos and that kind of stuff. So if you've been thinking about going out to the movies, but you're like, I don't want to spend $50 to take my family out to the movies, you can take a family of 4 for $12 or 16, I guess, because I got a Fandango discount too. Yeah, check that out, and then join us back here next week for If You Like, You'll Love, Gran Turismo, and The Last Starfighter, and more of this wonderful conversation. So thank you again, Jeff. This has been a pleasure as always. Jeff York of The Establishing Shot, and also Pipeline Artists. Was this the piece that you're referencing?
Yeah,
last week?
I think it might be in there tomorrow. I'm not sure. They usually put me in on Thursday or Friday, so hopefully you'll see it. And if you all look forward to or listening to this now, I'll appreciate you following me there as well.
Okay, well, I will drop the link to that down below whenever you send it to me, whenever it goes live. Yeah, thanks everybody again. If you like this content, please like and subscribe to the channel, and also be sure and follow Jeff's stuff, as well as all of Earth's Mightiest Critics. Information is down below. And until next time, whenever that is, whatever that is, which will be next Wednesday, we established the outro doesn't always work, Jeff, is what I'm getting at. Thanks a lot. Take care, and yeah, check out Blue Beetle. Or not, I don't know.
It might be fun for the kids, and if you go in with a little bit managed expectations.